Welcome back to our video series on building multi-language reports for Power BI in 2023. We've now reached part 4, creating and testing report label translations. Now, as you recall, there are 3 types of translations. We've already dealt with metadata translations, and what we saw is they were relatively easy to work with, especially with a tool like Translations Builder. Now we're going to move on to implementing report label translations. Now, the issue is that report labels don't have an associated data set object. So we, don't have any type of feature that's built into Power BI, to either track report label translations, or to surface them on a report page. Now, examples are things like report titles, the captions of the buttons in our navigation menu. And then sometimes, unfortunately, someone hard codes a text value, into the title of a visual, and that, isn't localizable as well. Now, the best practice, for implementing report label translations, is to use the user culture function and to write some type of a measure that's able to, come up with the correct translation on the fly dynamically, by looking at the first part of the user culture return value, using a switch statement, and having an explicit clause for each secondary language, and then using the translation for the default language, as the fallback if there's no match. Okay, now before we dive into the details of implementing report label translations, let's talk about when we need them, and then some other cases when you can avoid them and just rely on metadata translations. Now, there are common Power BI design report techniques that we've all used that do not support localization. So adding a text box or button and hard coding a text value in, is not something that, is localizable. Page tabs, unfortunately, can't be localized at all, the text inside them. So what we can't do is display page tabs to the user because they're OSB in the default language. Finally, hard coding text values, into the title property of a visual, will also cause problems, because there's no way to localize that hard coded text. Now, here's something that you can use to avoid needing a report label translation for a visual. So we have Cartesian visuals. Think of a bar chart or a pie chart, and it can assign a dynamic title property, and it does that by default. So just by virtue of the fact that you created this visual, and then you started adding the measure sales revenue to a data role and the product column and the year column to other data roles, it's automatically able to kind of build that title on the fly. So as long as you have supplied metadata translations, for the measure sales revenue and for the columns product and year, what's really nice is as the language, or the language and culture change, for the current user, the visual title will automatically change as well. So once again, look for opportunities where you could leverage the built-in metadata as much as possible. Now, I've seen many different companies, use different innovative approaches to implement report label translations. So you can say that there's not one single correct solution. There are many possible correct solutions. There are definitely also wrong solutions as well, so don't use those. But Translations Builder is going to use this one particular strategy that we feel, has a lot of, positive attributes. Now, the strategy is based on creating a hidden table, in the data model for your project, and this table is going to be named Localized Labels. Now, the idea is that for each new report label that you need, we're going to add a new measure to the Localized Label table. So when you add a measure, what are you doing? You're adding a dataset object. What do dataset objects support? Translations, metadata translations. So the idea is that if you can add a table and then add a set of measures into that table, you'll be able to, track translations, for that measure, just like we track translations for the other measures and columns, inside of our project. Now, translations for report labels, are tracked as metadata, for their associated measure. Now, an important part of the strategy is the localized label table, is used to collect and store the metadata, but it's not used to surface them. We'll see a little bit more about that later. But the idea is that as long as each report label, is represented by a measure, that measure then has the ability to add translations, just like all the other dataset objects in the current project. Now, the localized labels table is the one exception, where we display hidden dataset objects, in the translation grid. And there's just logic in Translation Builder saying, I'm not going to display you because you're hidden. Oh, wait a second. You're a measure from localized labels. We'll go ahead and add you, as a data set object, that the user can go ahead and add translations for. Now, what's nice is that Translation Builder provides all interaction with the localized labels table. So you never need to go to Power BI Desktop and do anything to the particular localized label table. You can see it there, it's hidden, but there's no need for you to, perform any tasks in the Power BI Desktop user experience. Now, here's a walkthrough. We're going to start by, in Translation Builder, we're going to drop down the Generate Translated Tables menu and choose the menu command, Create Localized Label Table, or Control-C. Now, when we do that, it's going to create the table. It's also going to prompt the user to see if that user wants more information, on the localized labels table. And the idea is that there's a bunch of concepts behind it that are very important to understand, if you're going to use this strategy effectively. Now, when it's time to add report labels, once Translation Builder sees that your project already contains the localized labels table, it then, provides the Add Labels to Localized Label Table command, or Control-A. Executing that command, will bring up the Add Localized Labels dialog. And if you want to add labels one at a time, bring up that dialog, type in your label, hit Add Label, and repeat as many times as you need. There's also an advanced mode. And the idea of advanced mode is it gives you a multi-line text box. So you can type in label 1, line break, label 2, line break, label 3, hit Add Labels and add them all at once. You can also upload labels from a text file if you have them. And then finally, also note there's a little danger zone down there. So when you create the localized label table, sometimes you want to start from scratch and get rid of labels. So there is that command there as well. Now, Translation Builder merges report label translations, with metadata translations. So the good news is that they're stored in the same format and they're stored in the same PBX file. I've seen other companies, they have a solution where the metadata translations are stored in the PBX file, but all their report label translations are stored in a CSV file that they import into their data model. That works great, except now the translations for one project, are spread out across two different files and two different, formats. So what's really nice about this is not only, do we put report label translations, into the same format and the same storage, we also give the exact same editing experience as metadata translations, because basically report label translations are metadata translations. So let's say that I've just added a couple labels and I want to quickly generate machine translations for them. Hey, that's no problem. Once again, you have the same mindset you need, to work with both metadata translations and report label translations. You and I were thinking the same thing. Let's get back to the lab. Okay, now, what we finished up at the end of exercise 2, was metadata translations. So for instance, if I go to Spanish, I'm going to see things like the headers of the table and the measure names on the cards and certain aspects like the title of the column chart, are all localized. But things that aren't localized is this report title, these button captions. And if I go to the second page right here, I'll also see that, some wise aleck on our team hard-coded in, a text value for this visual, so it's not, translating properly. Okay, so let's go ahead and head back, to our solution in Power BI Desktop. Now, let's go ahead And let's look at the data model as we kind of work through our next set of tasks. So the next thing that we're going to do is that we're going to generate the localized labels table. Now, there's absolutely no reason that you would need to monitor what's being done in Power BI desktop. I'm just doing that so you can see what's happening behind the scenes. So don't try this part at home. Let's go ahead and say, create the localized label table. Now here, one of the things that you can see is the table's been created, but it's saying, would you like more info? What happens if I click yes? It just redirects me in the browser, to the article that we have, which goes through and explains exactly what I'm explaining to you right now, how the localized labels table strategy works. Now, back here, let's go ahead and start working through, adding labels. So notice that before, create localized labels table command, was enabled, but add labels wasn't. And once you've created the table, you can no longer create the table. It's already created, but now we can add labels, either by executing this command or just simply doing Control A. Now, let's say that, as I add this, I have the, product sales report. It's a simple label. I add that in, and it gets added down inside here. Now, note that when you create the localized label table, it adds a couple labels in. Just, as a proof of concept, you probably don't want these. There's a couple different ways to remove a report label. If you go into the fourth column and you double click on it, it allows you to change the values. But if you go one more column, the third column where it says localized labels, double click on that, and note that one of the things that you could do is, delete a label if you don't want it. Now, let's go experiment around with the add labels, and this time we'll pick advanced mode. So the first thing is we don't want any of those example labels that were added in, so let's go ahead and delete everything. Now, the next thing that we're going to do, is let's say that I know exactly what labels I need in my report, and I just have some text. So I'm going to go ahead and type that in, and now we'll go ahead and we'll add the labels inside there. Okay, great. And now that we've done that, let's just take a quick pass, by saying fill all empty translations. And as we do this, now we've done everything, that we need to do, in Translations Builder. So now let's go through the process of going back to Power BI. We'll go ahead and click Save. Now, we're not quite done yet. So what we've done is we've created localized labels and we've added translations to them. However, the localized labels table in and of itself does not give us, enough to actually surface the report labels on a report page. Now, version 1 of Translation Builder added the localized labels table, but it didn't go far enough. And as a result, it was very awkward to surface localized labels on a report page because you needed a custom visual or a very limited experience, using things that come out of the box. So the localized labels table strategy with 2.0 provides a much more natural way to surface report labels, on a report page. Now, translations for localized labels, are stored in that table, and they're used to generate a second table. So just like there's the localized labels table, there will also be the translated localized labels table. Now, the way it works is that every time you make changes, by adding a language or adding translations, you have to keep the two tables in sync by running a command called generate translated localized labels table. And the idea is when you generate that, it is going to provide, it's going to execute code that looks at the translations, for the measures and the localized labels table. And then it will build a measure, for each of those report labels. Now, that two different measures in the same project can't have the same name. So you can't give the measures the same name across these two tables. And so Translations Builder uses a simple strategy of taking a measure name like product sales report and just appending the word label to the end of the measure name. So product sales report label will be the thing that we use to surface that translation for a report label on a report. Now also note that in Power BI Desktop, the localized labels table is hidden. We never need a report author to see that. However, the translated localized label table is completely different. That is meant to be used, directly by report authors. So when you move into report view, you will see the translated localized labels table, has measures, very easy to use. And if we look at those measures, we can see that there was code to automatically generate those measures, by looking at the translations in the localized labels table. Okay, pretty neat stuff. It's just we have to remember to execute the generate translated localized labels table command. Okay, let's revisit the lab. The lab, we're to a point where we've generated the localized labels table. We've added our report labels and we filled in all the translations for them. Now the next thing that we're going to do, is we're going to call the command, which is to generate the translated localized label table. Now what you don't need to do, I'm going to do now just for illustration purposes. Let's go ahead and kind of look at what's happening, in the background. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, let's go ahead and generate the translated localized labels table. When that gets generated, you can see that, there is parity, between these two tables. Now, if I go to report view, and now we look here, one of the things that we're going to see right here is that the translated localized labels are what we use in report view. And once again, the fact that this one is hidden, and this one is, visible, basically just is an illustration of the fact that the translated localized labels table, is meant for report authors. Okay, now let's take a quick look-see at a couple of these measures. So I'll go to product sales report. And one of the things that you could see, is that it is just a set of DAX that's dynamically generated on the fly. Ignore the red underline user culture. That's just a regression we had in the December 2022 version of Power BI Desktop. Should be gone in the next release. So the red line means user culture is really important and you should use it all the time. I just made that up. Anyway, another thing to note is you should never go in and modify, anything that's inside here. Let's say that I go back here and, I make a bunch of changes to this. And now that I've made those changes, let's go ahead and go back here. And then we'll go ahead and one more time, we'll generate this. And what's going to happen is it's automatically going to, regenerate, all the DAX expressions for all the measures in the table. So the important point of the story, is do not modify DAX for measures in the translated localized labels table. Very good. Okay, now on to our next mission, which is in Power BI Desktop. We've got these measures. How do we actually use them, in a report? Now, the way that we're going to surface these report labels, on a report page is simply by taking a visual or a shape and configuring, one or more properties, with the label measures from the translated localized labels table. And the idea is that you can use a localized report label anywhere you can use a measure, and it will give you the dynamic translation. So, as an example, let's say you add a card visual, to your report. Well, you can simply take any of these measures and drop it right in the fields data role, and right away, instant gratification, there is your text that supports localization, that will switch as, the report loads in different languages. Next thing we're going to see is that rectangle shapes provide a great way to surface report labels. So let's say that I have a report page and I go to the Insert tab. I then drop down the Shapes menu and I pick one of these rectangle shapes. Once you pick a rectangle shape, we're then going to go to the Format pane. And I can change the fill, I can change the border, but it's the text property. Now, I'm going to go ahead and at first, let's say I hard code in hello world, for the text property. That is then hard coded text in the report layout. It cannot be localized. So what are we going to do? We're simply going to take the text property and configure it with one of our measures from the translated localized labels table. So we click on the FX button. It brings up the text properties dialog. We pick the measure we want from the translated localized labels table, and bang zoom, we're all done. Okay, now let's focus on localizing the page navigation menu. We want some type of a menu that allows a user to navigate from page to page, but we can't use the report page tabs because they don't support localization. So step number one in our strategy for creating a localized page navigation menu is to hide all the pages in report view, except for the first page, which we kind of consider the main landing page. Now, next step is you're going to create a report bookmark for each page to navigate to that page. And then what we're able to do is we're able to create some type of a toolbar with buttons. And what we're going to do is we're going to take each one of these buttons and we're going to, when someone clicks it, apply a bookmark to navigate to that page. Now, if you've worked with Power BI reports a lot, you probably know that you can't create a navigation menu like this and synchronize it across all pages. So we use what we call clipboard inheritance, generally to copy and paste. So it's a little bit clunky, but it gives us exactly what we want. Now, once you've got your buttons in place, as we saw in the previous slide, we configure a button click to apply a bookmark for navigation, but we also have to worry about the text, the caption shown to the user. So just like we did in the previous example, we're going to go to the text property, of the buttons here, and we're going to assign, each one to basically have its text pulled from a measure in the translated localized label table. Okay, so let's now finish up exercise 3 of our lab. So the point that we're at is we've generated the measures in the translated localized labels table, but we haven't used them. So let's go to product sales. And, once I click on this, I'm able to go down to style. I'm able to go down to text. You can see the hard-coded text that we give you in the lab starting point. So what you're going to be able to do, is just drill down and there is your product sales report. Okay, and then for the 3 buttons right here, so we'll go to the first button and there's the text property. This is for sales summary. So once again, I'll come down here and sales summary. Great. Let's keep moving down the line. This one is going to be sales by category. Great. And then the third one is going to be sales over time. Now, due to the way that Power BI reports work, we've had to duplicate, this across all 3 pages. So now we're going to go through the same steps of, going to the particular rectangle shape, and it has the report title. So now let's go down here and you can see me struggle through all different parts. There is the report title. There is now going to be the buttons. There is sales summary. And bear with me, just a couple more. There is sales by category. And the third button on the second page, just like the other pages, is sales over time. Now remember that the second page here is where we had the visual that has the hard-coded text. So during the lab, remember that, the visual on the first page is fine because it uses the default, which just basically pulls the measure and column names and supports localization automatically. Now for this right here, what we need to do is we need to kind of go and find, under the general tab and the title property, and there's the hard-coded text. This is the evil thing we want to get rid of. And so now, once again, let's go ahead and replace that with top selling products. Great. And now finally, you've seen it twice. Let's do it a third time. We'll go to the third page. And now I will quickly, go through this process of, let's go to the text property of the report label. And now that we have that, as quickly as Ted can, he will deal with the last three command buttons. First one is sales summary. Next one is sales by category. And finally, we have sales over time. And now we've changed everything that had report label translation, into using one of our measures that supports dynamic translations. Okay, so just finishing up, let's go back to the sales summary page. We want to have that selected before we hit save, because we want that to be our main landing page. Okay, and now we're all set to publish. Let's go ahead and publish back to our workspace. Okay, and now we can kind of finish up, by going and testing in the Power BI service, to make sure our report label translations are working correctly. So we'll start by looking at English, and obviously English is the default. That should look good. But now, as we use the bookmarks, to load the report as Spanish, we should see that the report title and the menu commands, look good, and they should look good across all three pages. When we get to page 2, we'll point out that we can kind of see that the visual, that had the the report label instead of having metadata driven title looks fine. And then we go to the last page, that looks good as well. And then we'll just kind of take 2 more victory laps, one with French, and we go and we see and verify everything looks good for French. And we move through page 1, page 2, page 3, things are looking good. And then finally we get to German, and with German 1, 2, and 3, and everything's looking good. So now we're at a stage where we have completed implementing both the metadata translations and the report label translations. The only type of translations that remain all in English, as an unimplemented to-do task, is data translations. And we will take those on, in the last 2 videos in this series. And yes, we will get to data translations. But first, part 5, where we talk about creating a workflow so you can integrate the humans that are acting in the roles of translators, into your whole multi-language report building process. Stay tuned.